From IGN's offices in San Francisco, welcome to Nintendo Voice Chat for the week of October 31st. Ooh, scary.
Is this the October version, the October 31st version or something?
Yeah, I guess.
Wow, that was pretty
It
frightening.
has to be.
Yeah.
Is it? Is it not?
Yeah.
Joining me, I'm your host, Jose Otero. Joining me is Per Schneider.
Yeah, I feel like
Once again.
it's like insanity effects coming on
Insanity,
here. Like,
you say?
Yeah.
No kidding. Special guest, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Denis Dyack from the newly formed company QE2, Quantum Entanglement Entertainment.
Got it. And folks may remember Dennis from a little company called Silicon Knights that knew a lot about Insanity, in fact. Sanity's Requiem, even, with
right.
Eternal Darkness.
Yep.
Very cool to have you on the show, man.
Oh,
Thank you
thanks
so much for
having
coming
me.
in.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
Very cool. So, gentlemen, where do we start for this very spooky special episode of Nintendo Voice Chat?
It's been a while. Actually, what's funny, since you haven't been here in a while, but after you were here last time, we actually got together at my house and we played a whole bunch of games. Like we just hooked up a GameCube and an N64, and we just plopped in cartridges, kept on switching out games.
German style, a lot of beer.
Yeah, and then we said, okay, let's play Eternal Darkness, and we really only wanted to play 30 minutes of everything, but we kind of got stuck playing and saying like, man, this game was great.
Yeah, and he stayed really quiet about the whole bathroom scene.
We worked on that scene. The bathroom scene is one of the ones we spent the most time on per capita, I'd say, as far as the scene was probably about a minute long, but we spent months on it trying to get it right. And we did little things like turn off the music. That's one of the few places in the entire game where there's no music.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And it's that kind of thing. When you walk into the room, you notice the music goes away. It just builds this tension, like something's changed. What's changed?
Yeah.
It's hard to notice. You don't know what it is. And then there's that whole screaming flash that it's one of the classic moments that everyone always tends to talk about with Eternal Darkness.
What's weird, too, is like I feel like you turning off the music should have tipped me off that
me
something
too,
was going to happen, but like it totally got him too, which was great. I kept on just waiting for it.
So it doesn't help though to tweet on social media with the other person in the room who has a cell phone and say, "Oh, I haven't told them about the bathroom." Ha ha ha. I look at my phone, I'm like, "Why am I being mentioned by Per as he's sitting right next to me?"
I didn't know you were gonna.
My
figured
phone
you
was
were
right
captivated.
In the room. But regardless, let's talk a little bit about first of all the developer's history in Silicon Knights, right? So you guys, your first big game was Cyber Empires. Was that sort of your first project as a group together?
Yeah, so Cyber Empires we did while I was doing my undergraduate in computer science.
Got it. Where were you studying at the time?
I was still doing the degree, and we started making it then. I had just transitioned. I just graduated from so my first degree is in physical education.
Okay.
My next one was computer science. So I started taking computer science only because I wanted to make video games. I was like, I want to make video games. I love this genre. I just feel I don't have the tools to do it. So I bit the bullet and put myself through computer science, and I was terrified. I ended up doing really well in the course. And then from there, I went on to do a master's in computer science, where we actually formed the company. And then we sold the publishing rights to SSI at the time.
Okay.
And the funny thing about Cyber Empires is it won Multiplayer Game of the Year by Computer Gaming World. There was no internet, and it was a hot seat game. So you'd do your turns, everyone would switch turns, and then the battles would be real time between some split screen with no resolution in 16 colors. And it's funny when you look back at it.
It's a board game on a computer, basically.
Yeah,
right?
Essentially, Cyber Empires was Total War. You know the Total War series. That's exactly what Cyber Empires was in 1991 on an Atari and an Amiga, because you would capture countries, build armies, and then fight. And it was all in 2D top-down, so it wasn't 3D like the Total War series. But yeah, that was our first game.
And so, did you already, when you're studying computer science, did you already spend part of the time at home working on a game, or how did it work?
Yeah, and we didn't have any idea what we were doing, and the main programming language at the time at the university was a programming language called Modula 2. So we bought a Modula 2 compiler and said, we're going to do this game in Modula 2. Bad idea. Didn't work. Not good for video games. So then we had to teach ourselves C, and that was before C++ and C# and all that. So we taught ourselves C, and then we programmed the whole thing again. And then we found out that wasn't fast enough, and then I had to learn assembly language. So then we learned assembly language, and we did. So it was just all of these steps. And we were students. We didn't know what we were doing. We just had the love for video games. We didn't know if there was any kind of business model. What I did one year was when I was doing my master's in computer science, I flew down to the West Coast. I was just, I want to find out there's a video game industry because someone's making video games and I want to find it. And I just made a couple calls, bumped into this one group at SSI. They saw it. They loved it. They go, we love it. We want to do this game, and we want to do a follow-up sequel.
Huh.
And so that's how Fantasy Empires came into being.
Got
and
it,
then
got it.
suddenly we had money, and we formed this company, and Silicon Knights started.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was so the dream was quickly realized, and it feels like we heard a similar story from Julian, actually, right? Where in Germany, the same sort of attitude where they were sort of, it wasn't, by the way, they're masters, but very much they had an interest in games. They were all sort of like just brainiac high schoolers who really like coding, and were just like, man, we want to do this. And then they just, but they did a little different because they were kind of
well, they were hackers.
They were hackers, yeah. They were pretty much.
Yeah.
They were recompiling. Oh my God, what was the game again? Was it Gradius? I can't remember. It was some of those shooters.
They were reverse engineering stuff. Yeah, that was very common in that scene for those guys. And I like those guys. They're great guys. And their Julian's company was very much a technology company. Yeah. And when Silicon Knights first started. My master's degree was in a little bit in artificial intelligence and a little bit of interfaces. Got it. And so that's what we focused on at first. But then after doing cyber, fantasy, and then Dark Legions, we then switched over to, when we made a game Dark Legions, it was kind of our homage to Archon. And for marketing, we created these cards, these player cards. And they were really cool writing these stories about what the background of each of them were, where you'd basically have these chess pieces you'd move around, and they all had their little stories and their little lore. When we were creating those, I had such a good time, and I remember sitting back with some of the guys at Silicon Knights going, I'm having such a good time. Why don't we make a story-based game? And then Legacy of Kain was born.
Which was the first classic I had played from your studio,
that was our
from
first
your team.
really big hit.
That was an awesome game.
And at that point, so you realize basically it's not just about coding and creating cool game systems. It's also about storytelling and kind of creating lore. And I know you're obviously. We'll talk about Eternal Darkness, but you were into, science fiction and horror and all of that kind of stuff. But it started there, really?
It really started there. And I guess when I started thinking about engagement theory and what makes a game important, because back then, there were all these people that were positive that they knew what it was. Like, a lot of people thought it was technology. Back at the time, id was, their engine was unstoppable. And everyone thought, okay, it's technology. It's first-person shooters. That's the way you have to be. And for a time, they were right. A lot of other people were, no, it's art. You look at games like Myst. Other people were like, no, it's all about music. And I just looked, and I just sort of sat back and went, well, what if it was a combination of all of these things, where you combine them in the right way and something becomes bigger than the sum of its parts? And that's when I started thinking about engagement theory, and that's the first time I did a talk at GDC was in 1996 about that. Wow. And we started looking at flow theory and Zygmunt Mahoy, and I'm big into collaborations with universities and modern psychology theory, and there needs to be a basis for gameplay on what a player is going to do and what are we going to use as a foundation, because right now, even for game designers now, there's still not a body of theory that they can work from. Right. And so back then is when I first started thinking about it, and that defined really what I think video games should be and where they should go. And now with QE2 and where we're going, we're combining even more mediums now. And what they know in film and television, the production value and the script writing is so, frankly, still much, much higher than video games. And combining that with the interactive nature of video games now, it's funny because you see my partners looking around here, they're just sort of like, what is going on in this place?
They come from to let everybody in on it, they come from the movie space, right?
Right, films and television. And we just finished doing some Metal Gear Solid podcasts, and they were like, okay, so you were talking while you were playing the game? I was like, yep, very common.
Just watch your kids, they do it all the time.
They're like, okay. And so these spaces don't talk to each other. Yeah. If you talk to people from film and television, they really don't know what the video game space is like. Yeah. And so, and the same, frankly, with me, I don't know, when I'm learning so much about film and television, talking with these guys and seeing how that business works, the idea of bringing those together, because we are talking about convergence now. When you see television becoming so big, it's really following along the analogy of commoditization and services, where you get microtransactions. Like, TV is essentially an 8-hour. Like, if you look at True Detective, which I love,
good show.
It's an 8-hour movie.
Yeah,
and it's really servicing people over a long period of time through. That's what's happening in that industry, and it's paralleling our industry. Yeah. So let's bring them all together. That's the idea. So it's all these kind of things that I get really, really excited about.
It's real. I mean, it's obviously really exciting stuff, and I think we all agree that games are still not at the level of true detective storytelling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there are very few examples in gaming where you're getting a story that holds up to the very end, where the ending feels like it was planned for, and the emotional impact is as big as it can get.
And that's kind of where games sort of fall short in a lot of cases, where it's always the build-up is fantastic, and then the end is completely not in line.
But the great thing is it's coming.
Yeah.
And this is all coming. This convergence is coming.
Yeah.
And then that's not even talking about I don't know what to call it. I used to call it mobile space, but I don't think it's called the mobile space anymore. But you've got the tablets and all of these guys that the traditional gaming guys look at them and they're kind of like alien. Like, what are they doing? But, they're doing good stuff, but no one knows what the secret of success is. All of that's going to come together in such a way where and I hopefully we'll be able to make some serious inroads, but there's going to be a time when someone's going to say, okay, this is how we do all of this stuff. This is how we bring all this great talent together, and we're going to make something that's truly a watershed movement for entertainment. And it's exciting time.
Definitely. Sure. I wanted to go back just to Legacy of Kain for a second, because, I think a lot of our listeners will probably know the name not from your original game, but from Soul Reaver, right?
Yeah.
Which was, how do you, so you didn't you didn't have ownership of the Legacy of Kain franchise, and then it kind of took on a life of its own, and a different developer made a really interesting game. But it's how did that happen?
Well, it's a funny story. So
is it really funny or is it irritating?
Well, it's a bit of both, really. I can laugh about it now. I'll be able to laugh about everything. So I guess I'm one of those developers that's been privileged to have some very, very high highs and some very, very deep lows. And looking through all of the past. The one thing that I can say moving forward is that I've learned a lot. And I certainly learned a lot from that experience. So Legacy of Kain, we developed and created entirely at Silicon Knights. Okay. And the actual concept of the Soul Reaver was a concept from 2 Human. It was actually a weapon in 2 Human that I brought over. I liked the concept so much, I actually put it in Legacy of Kain. I wrote in. So for those who don't know, I wrote a lot of the script for Legacy of Kain. I've written a lot of stuff in all of our games. And what happened is basically Crystal Dynamics at the time, who was the publisher, ran out of venture and became a developer and wanted to develop the series on their own, but we had the rights for that, and we got into a big fight. And there was a litigation, and it ended up settling, and it all worked out fine. And they went on to get bought out by Eidos and continue the Legacy of Kain series. But we did create Legacy of Kain and Nosgoth and all of that. So that's the story. So it's not that bad.
It's just, but
I've got worse stories.
In hindsight, but it's like, in hindsight though, is it kind of a lesson for young, budding game designers and developers to secure the IP, to make sure that they own a piece of it, or is it just is it so different nowadays?
It's very different because self-publishing is becoming such a big thing, and owning the IP is very, very important. But without being able to self-publish it, that's almost never going to be the case. So the industry that Silicon Knights used to be in, I don't know if it even exists anymore, where you basically get money from a publisher and then you publish the product and you get a percentage of the royalties. I don't think deals like that are even being made anymore. They've taken it all internally, which is also that business model, the AAA model, is under siege right now too. It's hard to make money. So owning the IP when you self-publish, it's just a given these days because you're self-funding it anyway. So why wouldn't you own the IP? So always try to keep the IP for sure. And it's funny because the Soul Reaver idea it's got a lot to do with angels, and it's not really where we ever would have taken the series, and it's not the same. I know there's a lot of people like it, and I'm not criticizing it at all. I'm just saying that's not where we.
It's a different direction.
It's definitely completely different direction than we were going with it.
Yeah, and obviously we never experienced that kind of connection to the franchise, right? Like in your head, you know where you wanted Kain to go, and then here comes this completely different game, right? Like
I actually had a 5-story arc planned out for the whole thing, where it's just like talking about what the Pillars of Nosgoth were really for, how they got there, and there's all that backstory that never really got explored as far as I saw in the series. And they took it in their own direction, and now there's a multiplayer game out there. What I tried at E3 actually, and that's again something totally different. Last thing I ever would have done.
But now you've got a company that creates movies, television, and games entertainment. You could dig up some of the old concepts, and there'll be the Legacy of Bane
Legacy
show,
of Kain.
maybe,
Call it something else.
I don't know about that, but certainly you can learn from all of the things that you've done, and one of the things. So as an example, you look at Eidos and which is now part of Square, I think.
Mm-hmm. Square Enix.
And there's no reason why we couldn't work with those guys in the future to talk about films, television. I don't have no idea what they're doing with Legacy of Kain, but certainly I can say with extreme confidence that no one knows Legacy of Kain like we do.
Yeah.
Because I was the original creator, and if they're looking to restart that franchise, and turn it into something that would be truly unique and look at it from different mediums and do that would be a great idea.
Sure.
And we're not talking right now. I don't want to give
that
impression.
Absolutely. Yeah,
but it's just it's just fun. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
First on IGN, but
so there was quite a bit of time between Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain, and Eternal Darkness. Do you feel so sort of what was going through your mind with Eternal Darkness and the first pitch for that? Like, where was Silicon Knights? I'm assuming this was post the litigation with
it was
Crystal D.
Yeah, so Eternal Darkness didn't get pitched. We were pitching another game entirely. And
Too Human?
Nope. No, it was a different game.
Okay.
I actually never talked about it. Probably shouldn't at this point. But it is a totally different game based upon different things. And there's so many different game concepts in my head. But I remember, so right at the time before I was flying down to pitch Nintendo this game, I'd stayed up, because this is what you do when you're young and you don't think. And I was younger back then and not as I guess... Well,
not as careful.
Not as careful. And I'd like to think I'm more careful these days. And some would argue. I stayed up all night playing Resident Evil 2. I finished the whole thing. I stayed up for 3 days in a row before I flew down to Nintendo to pitch. And it's for anyone who doesn't know, it's a 5.5-hour flight to Seattle from Toronto. And I was completely burnt out. I sat down with the producer at the time from Nintendo, who was Henry Sturcey, who we later worked together really closely. And he looked at me and goes, "You look tired." And I was like, "Dude, I just played Resident Evil 2 and it was awesome." And he's like, "I know." And he's like, so we started talking about all this stuff. And I just looked at him and said, "That's a damn good game. I would love to make a game like that." And he goes, "You should make a game like that." And he goes, "Can you think of a pitch?" And I said, "Yeah. Well, I've got this idea that's Lovecraftian. And we wouldn't want to do it like Resident Evil because they're good enough at it now, and Nintendo would never take a copycat game anyway. They would never want to do it. But I said, this is what I would do, and I started talking about Babylon 5 and how it's all structured around story rather than main characters, how there'd be characters over time. And he goes, "Oh, let's talk about this some more." So we started talking about it, and we pitched it, and boom, it happened.
But how, like, when I think going to Nintendo and pitching a game, like, Resident Evil would have been the last thing to pitch to them, at the time.
It wasn't.
Like,
it was
directionally,
So at the time, Nintendo was looking at expanding their demographics.
Okay.
And they were talking to us because we did serious content. We were a violent video game creator. Legacy of Kain was not par for the course. Back then, when we created Legacy of Kain, people were like, "You're creating a vampire game? What? And the vampire is evil and everyone wants to kill him? That's like an anti-hero." And we're like, "Yes." And in this, when we pitched Eternal Darkness, they were looking at it going, "Everyone dies." And I go, "Yes." And they're like, "But that's sad." And I'm like, "Yes, people die. They're real heroes." And it took a long time to digest this stuff because it wasn't what they were used to, but that's why they wanted to go in that direction, because they wanted something different. A lot of people criticize Nintendo. I personally love Nintendo because they take a lot of risks and they're willing to go into areas that they're uncomfortable with. And certainly Eternal Darkness, they had never seen anything like it. Everything before then had been solely character-based games. This was a plot-based game, an environment-based game, where you played multiple characters over time, where some characters you played only for 20 minutes and they died. The Centurion, Pius Augustus, was like 5 minutes, and then boom, you're dead. And I remember...
Spoilers.
Yeah, for those who haven't played. But I remember when we did the Paul Luther scene, where you have that really long level. It's like, that's one of the longest levels in the game. You go through the cathedral, and then you see the Greater Guardian,
Is that the guy who deteriorates as he explores?
No, that's Anthony. That's
Anthony.
He's the zombie. He's already dead from when it starts.
Man, that was a grueling one.
Yeah, that one. The people. But the interesting thing about that is no one knew you were immortal. You couldn't die. You just grow back. But no, this is the one where you play the priest.
Oh, the priest. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And you go right to the end where you think you have this big boss fight and you just get squashed, and it broke every single expectation of the gamer because at that point you're ready for this boss fight. And then when we killed it, I remember sitting down with a lot of the game designers from Nintendo, and we showed them that, and they were just looking at us like, "What? That's it?" And I go, "That is it!" And they were like, "Oh, Dennis, I don't know." And but they were great. They kept it in, and they helped us polish a lot of stuff. They really helped us with the boss fights a lot. We learned a ton, and it was those kind of moments that really I remember the relationship. And some of the best moments we're talking about the insanity effects, like the leading of the save game. Mm-hmm. Mr. Miyamoto, myself, a lot of the executive producers from Nintendo had long discussions, and they had really good points. They're like, people could look at this, get really angry, throw their GameCube against the wall, break it, and it would be our fault because we're fooling them into thinking that their game has been deleted.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, I don't know. I think we should do it.
How did you swing that? How did you convince them?
I just said it's different. I think it's entertaining. I think we should take the chance. And it was ultimately their decision, and they did it. That was hard because back then the consoles were all about, if there's anything wrong with this console, we guarantee it. Customer service is really, really high.
Yeah, especially with Nintendo.
Nintendo, it's high. I would say out of all the third parties, they care about their hardware more than anything. You can run. I remember throwing my GameCube against a wall a couple times and it not breaking. It is a solid piece of machinery, and they were ready to bite the bullet on extra customer service calls. They're like, let's just do it. Let's do this thing. It's going to be different.
That's great.
And really, there were some crazy, crazy times with that game, and it really has some good memories. And I think that it really was set apart because Nintendo, when we were working together on that project, they really had a chance to work with us in a really different way. I don't think they had a chance to work with other developers that way. Yeah. Clearly, from North America, and I started learning Japanese. I wanted to communicate, so it's really rusty now, but I actually got really good at speaking Japanese and I started getting lessons like in the morning, like 4 or 5 times a week, because I wanted to communicate so much. When you have ideas about, when you're creative and you want to talk about your ideas, like I'm hyper now and I'm talking with my hands. Imagine what it's like when they don't speak the language and you have to wait for a translator.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, even in interviews now where I'm just like, I would love to say something else, but he's still saying what I said just a second ago.
Yeah. And you just sit there and so...
it's a very special kind of meeting for folks who have not.
Very hard. They're hard. It takes a lot of patience, and you get really worn out by them. And but we created some magic there, and I'll never forget some of those days. I'll never forget some of the things that we did and some of the things that we talked about, some of the laughs that we had. And one of the most interesting conversations, and I assume not a lot of people know this now, but is when we were almost finished the N64 version. We're running in high resolution without the extra memory pack.
Yep.
And there was a unilateral decision to stop making games for that console, and we reset it for the GameCube. That was hard to tell the team.
Yeah.
Because the game looked amazing.
Yeah.
And that's where I was just talking to Fran outside.
I saw it running, yeah.
Yeah, and that's where Fran and I first met. And there's so many questions like, why did it get delayed and blah, blah, blah. And it was just a decision of, we're moving to the GameCube. Timing's... Well, Conker's Bad Fur Day was the last one to be released, and that was it.
And it tanked, right? I mean, in hindsight, certainly the right decision to move to the next console, right? Like Conker arguably would have been a bigger game had it not been at the very tail end of the N64.
Well, you had the tail end effect, and then you had the cost of the cartridges.
Oh, yeah.
So it was it was an economic move. And not necessarily because of how Conker did, but where they saw the console going, it was starting to fall off.
Yeah.
And so for us, we had done all this cool technology, like getting that thing to run in 640 by 480 without that extra memory cartridge. It's really hard to do that, actually, especially with collisions and stuff. You You need to have all kinds of 3D data. And we did it. And I remember when we showed everyone from Nintendo the first time we were running in high res, they actually walked over to see if there was a memory card in the debug kit.
Did they really?
Yeah, because no one had done it before.
Probably Dean Spear was there with Turok a couple of minutes earlier and showed him. Yeah.
Well, it's funny. It was funny because we actually hand coded, in code, some of the collision data to get that work because there was such a restricted amount of RAM. But it saved so much money if you did that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the idea was this is going to be a good game and it's not going to cost that much to manufacture. But then, of course, you just look at the long run. It's just like, well, it's even cheaper to go to the the GameCube. And then we redid the entire engine and started over. And
did it have any sort of negative impact on the game at all? Sort of having to start over, essentially?
I don't think so. I think there was a drag on the team at the first little bit. There was a real big morale hit because we were doing great. It was like you're going to be on time, and and Eternal Darkness suffered from. It seems that we run into these roadblocks that you just don't expect, and I seem to be a gravitator towards these. So we got the N64 version, and then just before we were about to release the GameCube version, which had some Arabic content, 9/11 happens.
Oh,
That's right.
George W. Bush, President Bush, says he's going to start a new crusade, and we have Crusaders in our game. And we're just like, no. And this is not anyone's fault. We're just like, I'm just sitting back going, what are we going to do? And this is at the time when Anthrax is going through the mail. People are freaking out. We flew to Japan, and the game almost got canceled right there because we had some Arabic content in. And it wasn't negative Arabic concept. It actually showed the Crusader in a bad light. He wasn't a good person.
Yeah.
We flew over there and we rewrote a quarter of the game and got it out 6 months later. And everyone blamed us for being late. It was like, oh, Silicon Knights is late again. It was like, we couldn't say anything. But I think the game actually got a little bit better from that too, because we had a chance. We had some crisis management on storytelling, but at the same time, we were able to hone a few more game mechanics and really think about the sanity effects more, put in a few more sanity effects. Again, Nintendo stood up to the plate and said, no, we're going to do this game. This is a good game. And, we wanted to make sure there was nothing offensive to anyone, and which was really a tightrope at the time. It was pretty scary out there. When we flew down to Japan that time, it was probably about a month after 9/11. Return flight from New York to Kyoto was $99 and the plane was empty. No one was getting on a plane then.
Yeah.
And it was a scary time to fly.
Yeah, and I can imagine.
It was very, very different, and we went down there under the pressure of probably, I knew at the time it was the best game I'd created in my life, and it was about to get canceled because of something that was completely out of my control.
Sure.
And but we saved it, and I'm glad it made it out.
And it came out, and I feel like Eternal Darkness is one of those games where if you go in knowing nothing, you will have an amazing experience. Like, now, and people listening to this podcast now go back and play the game, they know kind of like the setup, right? That you're playing through these characters who are not long for this world, and they know that there are sanity effects. Like, even though we knew all that when we were playing, like, he got you once too. You thought the game was glitching out.
Yeah. No, it did. More than once, actually. And I was actually going to ask about that, sort of what provoked your desire to kind of mess with the player, because we'd seen sort of pokes and nods at the fourth wall in games, but this was sort of a different shift.
We took it to the end. Actually, patented the idea with Nintendo. So the idea was, this goes all back to violence in video games. So at the time, I was part of a group within the IGDA looking at violence in video games, because it was a lot of attacks on video games saying violent video games are creating violent behavior. So I was part of the group that looked through all the studies, and we looked through all the studies, and there was nothing that had showed any kind of correlation or evidence that there's anything substantial at all. There's some minor stuff, but really there's nothing out there. There's still no studies that show this, because there hasn't been anything. And so we reported back, and they were basically like, this is all political. This doesn't seem real. And they're like, okay. And it kept going. So after this and so I got frustrated by it personally, and I was like, okay, well, if they're accusing us of making games that's messing with people's heads, let's make a game that tries to mess with people's heads. So that's why we created them. We're going to screw with everyone as much as we can. And so we went and said, let's do these sanity effects. Let's try to frustrate people. Let's see what happens. And it was all within a Lovecraft perspective of sanity, so it made sense thematically with the game. a lot of Lovecraft homages in Eternal Dark. I'm a huge Lovecraft fan, and I'm a big believer in cosmic horror and a lot of the stuff that he's done in Clive Barker and a lot of those type of horrors. And that's where it all came from, and it was, really a reaction to the environment at the time.
Yeah.
Were there any sort of sanity effects that were too hot for GameCube, or just like we shouldn't do that? Any ideas that just didn't pan out?
We ended up doing them all. Some of them. It's funny because when we went over to do Too Human with Microsoft after, they're like, blue screen of death, huh? Pretty funny.
Oh.
You're pretty funny, Dennis.
What did that?
I'm like, yeah, I am. And it's just kind of like, what do? You can't apologize for it.
Yeah,
I can apologize for it. It's like,
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff in it. And did you just tell the team, hey, come up with these? Like everybody.
Yeah, what's that
just
pitch
think
meeting
of
even
something?
look
How
like?
did you do that?
Those are one of the most fun pitch meetings. And if you look at Shadow of the Eternals, we're doing the same thing. It's one of the most popular forms. What are some of the sanity effects you want to do? Yeah, people went crazy with it. And Gina, who's a programmer at the time, her and I sat down and put them all together and really created them. My personal favorite is the leading of the save game. That was one. I came up with that one. And I remember sitting down and programming how slow that meter went. It's got to be like really slow. You don't want it to go fast. And we did focus testing actually with that. A colleague of mine, Dr. John Mitter, is a psychologist. Nintendo gave us the leeway to sit down and focus test some of these things. So we sat in the room and we watched people, what would happen when the TV volume gets turned down. And we were like, wow, this stuff is really working.
Yeah.
And back then with TVs, most of the displays were almost the same. Now they're all wildly different.
Yeah.
But back then, that
green bar thing,
green
right?
bar thing was
Everybody had
universal
that.
pretty much. Yeah. So we could get away with it.
But you think about it today, though. You have a new canvas. Everybody either has an iPhone or an Android phone.
know.
They all make the same buzzing noise when it's muted and somebody calls you. And a lot of them have the same notification for text messages. So you can really screw with people that way nowadays.
Social media.
Yeah.
Social media is untapped territory for sanity effects.
Oh yeah.
It's very exciting, and there's all kinds of things that you can do, especially if they give you permission to go through the data. Like a lot of those folks. Oh, you could do so much fun stuff. It would be really fun to do, and those are some of the things I look forward to in the future with some of the new stuff we're doing.
Yep.
Okay.